everyone, to the last Talk Polymath episode for 2021. I'm Terry Schindler from Polyplexus. For those of you joining us who don't know about Polyplexus, we are the host of this podcast. We're a platform for scientific and technical creators focused on accelerating interdisciplinary innovation through evidence-based conversation. You can join us at polyplexus.com. So now let me introduce our Talk Polymath guests. We're so pleased to have Peter Bergman along with Sara Nadel of the Learning Collider, which is a lab using tools from economics and machine learning to create digital platforms for real-time research and social impact. Learning Collider Social Sciences research is focused on developing equitable technology across education, housing, and employment. In addition to heading up the Learning Collider, Peter is currently an associate professor of economics at UT Austin, co-editor for the Journal of Public Economics, and co-chair of the Education Technology Initiative at JPAL at MIT. Sara has a Ph.D. from Harvard's Kennedy School of Public Policy and was an Emerson Collective Dial Fellow for her work in labor market innovation. She's the COO of Learning Collider. Welcome to you both.
Thank you so much.
I think we'll start with, tell us a little bit more about the Learning Collider and what you're exploring with real-time research and social impact. What does that mean?
Yeah, great question. So what excited us about this idea of having real-time impact was the idea that a lot of research and a lot of researchers are leveraging data sets that are gathered from public agencies, at least in social science, when we focus on social science research. So we get data sets from the federal government, state and local governments, education, school districts, and those data sets are immensely useful. They often lead to research that can subsequently be presented back to policymakers, and then hopefully those policymakers can translate that research into impact. And that's in the best case scenario. But what's increasingly true is that technology platforms are collecting a lot of tremendous data that these government and state, local agencies just simply don't have access to. So in the education setting, this might be measures of parental engagement, student behaviors, and sort of granular levels of learning that are simply not captured in ways that by test scores, for instance, or even GPA. But it could be similarly in the housing market. We're seeing demand for real-time indicators on changes in rent, on changes for reasons to moving, or understanding the housing search process over time for low-income families. And in the employment space, it might be trying to understand how workers showing up for job interviews, showing up for the first day of work, attrition rates. And these are not things that are easily captured in data sets that social scientists traditionally have access to. And a reason for that is technology platforms aren't always built for research and for researchers to access these data. There's a number of hurdles we have to work through. But the benefit of working with these platforms is not only that we have access to these novel data sets that can produce insights around inequality and promoting equality of opportunity, but it can also help us realize impact in a much more rapid and scalable way. We can develop innovations, test them all on the same platform, and then when we find successes, we can scale them at a scale that is hard to do otherwise, and at a speed that is hard to do otherwise.
So that's really helpful. And I think that actually informs your model, which is a traditional academic model in some ways, and then a consultative model in other ways with certain partners. Can you talk a little bit about how you're organized and how you see that? I feel like it's a hybrid.
Yeah, it's definitely a hybrid. I think it's kind of a blurry line. I think Sara could speak to as well. I'll say we don't view ourselves as a consultancy. What we try to do is choose projects that are of mutual interest to our platform partners and ourselves as researchers who want to have social impact. And what that means is our incentives are aligned. And when the incentives are aligned, we can get the research done, but also when we bring philanthropic dollars to build these innovations on a platform, our platform partners have the incentive to cover the variable cost to see them scaled. And that's where I think this hybrid model comes in. But Sara, feel free to add to that description.
Yeah, well, so thank you, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here. And I joined Learning Collider after 10 years in the startup world, working at launching a venture-backed startup that was also related to technology and technology development. And so one of the things that Peter and I have been working on in terms of our own model at Learning Collider is, as Peter said, we're partnering with for-profit companies whose hearts may be very much in the place of striving towards equity, but they are under their own financial returns pressure to allocate their funds in a different direction. The thing that's really cool about the work that we're doing is that it's not, after it's built, it's not super high maintenance, or it's easier to maintain than, for example, some of the microfinance projects where I got my start working in academia. So once we've developed the technology, and one of the things that we're working towards, which I know Peter will talk more about, is algorithm fairness. Once we've adjusted algorithms for fair, with a fairness constraint in mind, the partner, maybe we've done it with a smaller subset of the applicable universe for the partner. The partner can take it and run with it and grow. There's not really money changing hands per se. There's a technical assistance component on our end, and we're able to draw conclusions and write papers and make sure that the world knows about what we've learned. But the partner gets something that's tangible that allows them to meet their social goals without compromising their financial goals.
Right. Okay. So that makes sense. So let's just take a step backwards. How did you get here? What got you interested in this?
Peter, I think you're on mute.
Thanks. I had some background noise. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it goes back all the way to when I was a teacher in New York City, in Harlem, and was quickly recognizing the poor quality of communication between parents and schools to parents, and also between parents and their children about how well they're doing in school. We'd have parents come to teacher conferences, and we'd be telling them about how often their child is absent in school. And this is 15 years ago now. And the parents said, oh, I'm sending my daughter off to school. We watch her go out the door, and lo and behold, she was going out the door, waiting 15 minutes, and then promptly going back home after her parents had left for work. And the school was just not adequately notifying them about what was happening. And so this prompted me to run an experiment where I was in graduate school in Los Angeles. We were working with 2 schools in downtown LA. And the idea was, let's provide as close to real-time indicators about how their child is doing in school as we can back to parents, and in particular, low-income families who might not have access to this information via online portals and such. So I would go to the teachers and schools each day, gather information about every child's missed assignment, their absences, their grades, create this big Excel spreadsheet, and then spend my weekends tapping out text messages to families about all their kids' missed assignments and grades. And this was really effective. And we saw impacts on GPA, test scores, 25% increases in assignment completion. And the parents, were asking their kids, hey, this Peter guy says you're not doing any of your work, to the point that the kids would go around and ask each other if they've been Petered yet. I was this ethereal figure in the background, essentially, kind of telling on them. And so we had this successful intervention that was really cheap, but publishing a working paper.
Meant you didn't have a life.
Yeah. So we had this academic research, but it couldn't be scaled through through poor graduate student labor, essentially, like myself, punching out text messages manually. And so the founder of these schools said, we just hired this gradebook company, this student information and learning management system. They're based in Santa Monica. Why don't you go chat with them, see if there's a way to bring this to scale? And that's how this really started. I talked to the CEO and COO there, who were around my age and are still friends to this day, and said, this is great. We'd love to do this. We could just automate this whole process. We're already gathering all these data in the teacher grade books. We have all the contact information through the student information system, which we connect to. We could pre-populate text messages and automatically send them out for a fraction of a cent. And this was amazing to me because, one, they had this incredible data that I was previously going to the district and getting teacher by teacher, to get this gradebook level information on every assignment the student had. And at the same time, once we demonstrated that this works, we could do this for the hundreds of districts that are in our portfolio. And we sent in one experiment that was a follow-up. Once we actually developed the intervention on that platform, we sent out 32,000 text messages for $64 over the course of an academic year. And we saw massive improvements in district retention, class level attendance, almost 30% reductions in course failures, all because we were realizing kind of the power of these technology platforms working with a researcher to bring evidence-based interventions to scale. And they were really enthusiastic. So I should just say, that kind of led to the idea that, hey, this could work in a number of settings.
So let's talk about that, because one of my questions was, you mentioned on your site that you talk about education, housing, employment as key determinants of social mobility. So in terms of your work, how do they inform one another? Or are they fundamentally different one from the next? And you just happen to look at those three verticals.
Yeah. I'll say, as an honest researcher, a little of both. We had relationships with these with organizations in those spaces, but the intersection of these three areas is pretty striking, to the point where there's a saying that housing policy is school policy, and vice versa, right? So we think about school choice and providing access to high quality schools. Well, the vast majority of the US, where you live determines where you go to school. And so you can't provide access and choice without helping families move to the neighborhoods associated with better schools, however measured. And so these are necessarily joint decisions. You're thinking about housing at the same time as you're thinking about schools, if you have the bandwidth, and at the same time you're thinking about where you work, right? So distance to any of these aspects, from your home to your office, from your home to your child's school, are huge predictors of where you live. So there's a lot of cross-cutting themes in these works, and they're highly complementary.
But you haven't done work that unites them yet. I mean, we know that globally they're united.
Yeah,
in the human life.
I think in that, the housing space is one really good example of this. So we work with affordablehousing.com, formerly Go Section 8, and they're the largest provider of housing listings for low-income families in the country. You could think of them sort of like a Zillow, but focused on providing listings for low-income rentals that with a focus on accepting housing choice vouchers or Section 8. And previously, there was no school quality information associated with the listing. So if you looked at a rental unit, you wouldn't see all that much neighborhood information, a walk score, but you wouldn't know the schools associated with that unit. So again, if you live in a particular area, it's more often than not zoned to a particular set of schools. And if you go to Zillow or Trulia that cater to high-income families who are buying homes, school quality information is prominently displayed next to every housing listing, and research has shown that those ratings actually get capitalized into the prices of that house. So there's better schools zoned to a particular house, you'll be paying more for that house because that amenity is captured. But that wasn't true for low-income housing listings. So we worked with great schools a nonprofit provider of school ratings to help them add school quality ratings onto the listings of affordablehousing.com. We worked with Department of Housing and Urban Development to link data from our platform partner, Affordable Housing, to where families actually move. And we demonstrated that in a randomized trial that the additional school quality information helped families move to neighborhoods with better schools. And once we demonstrated that, Affordable Housing, like, this is great. We're going to just do this for everybody. So 60,000 families a day searching for housing now reap the benefits of this intervention that helps them move to neighborhoods with better schools.
And that's really what you guys mean when you talk about impact. So you're really saying, what is the driver of impact, and then how do we scale that impact? Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Researchers were often thinking about publication process and publishing in journal articles, but really a win for us is showing that we've developed rigorous evidence, at a level that can be published in journals. We do that, obviously, but really impact for us is how many families are benefiting from the interventions that we have developed and scaled.
So, so that's housing, right? And that's a really good example of housing and education working together. But when you look at I know you do a lot of other educational pilots and education partners. When you look at impact in education, what are you really looking to do? What are you focused on?
Yeah, great question. So one of the cross-cutting themes across our work is around algorithms and their sort of potential benefits, potential pitfalls, and how can we reap the benefits while avoiding some of the dangers of algorithmic bias. And that's come up again in all three of our research areas, but in the education space, that we have a particular focus on, I guess, three areas where that is showing up. So one, it's well documented that we see gaps in course taking advanced coursework by socioeconomic status and racial demographics. And this can be despite students from minoritized groups being well prepared to take advanced courses. They're simply not offered, or they're unaware that they could take and pass this coursework. So we're working with one of our providers to measure the impacts of these courses on students of different backgrounds, and then generate a recommender system that can help ameliorate some of the gaps in course taking that we see across groups, so that they're both the schools are aware that they've got students prepared enough to take these courses, and that students are aware that of the same aspect, that they are prepared and can be successful in these courses and should consider taking them. Similarly, there's algorithms to flag students who are at risk of not graduating. These are called early warning systems that warn schools about students who are at risk of dropout. There's actually more than 50% of schools have some sort of early warning system in place. And yet we know little about the behavior and efficacy of these algorithms, and whether are they systematically flagging students from different backgrounds despite having the same potential risk of not graduating. And so we're doing work in that area to evaluate the efficacy, but also these sort of discriminatory properties potentially.
So let's talk more broadly, because you brought it up now, about AI and equity. What informs the point of view of the lab on this? It's a big topic.
Yeah. So I'll take a stab at this, and Sara, feel free to follow up. But I think when you talk about algorithmic bias and the potential but also the potential benefits of algorithms, I can think of at least two important points that should be discussed. One is relative to what? What is the counterfactual here? Often it's a human decision maker. And guess what? We have evidence from hundreds of years of showing bias and prejudice in human decision making. And the second aspect of that bias in humans is we also have a lot of evidence that it can be extremely difficult to change. Right? If somebody is exhibiting racial prejudice, it is not easy to change those behaviors whether it's quote unquote implicit or much more explicit. And the second aspect is when thinking about algorithms, so there's the relative to what, but also that in some ways it's much easier to audit an algorithm for discrimination than it is to audit a human's decision making. You can look at the code, you can run simulations, and you can measure disparate impact in ways with algorithms and understanding what's going on much more easily than you can sort of get into the head of a decision maker. If you've got a judge making a bail decision and you say, well, were you kind of looking at that person's appearance when you're making that decision to release or not? That's pretty difficult to get at. But with an algorithm, you can reverse engineer these systems and actually do just that. And increasingly, what we've been working on are the tools to explicitly ameliorate that impact, and as Sara had mentioned, develop algorithms with fairness constraints associated with them as well.
Yeah, if
Sara,
I could build
please.
on that a little bit. That was, I agree with Peter had some great examples there. And I think that thinking about how, I chose to get here and get into this line of work as well, technology is making decisions on our behalf all the time. And it's going to happen regardless. There are some really, really high profile automated technology failures, which I think really stick in people's minds. The two that I always think of are the racist chatbot on Twitter. I don't know if that sounds familiar, but it took about 2 hours for a chatbot to gravitate in a particular direction. And in hiring, there's this famous failed case of Amazon trying to figure out who their best salespeople were by crunching data and discovering that their best salespeople were men named Brad who played lacrosse in college. And so what that's doing is creating a real valid wave of sort of anti-technology for some of these issues. But it's not, technology is so broad. And so there are a lot of small decisions that go into what the final outcome is. There's decisions about the inputs. You might ask why lacrosse was an input, for example, in this analysis. And then there are decisions made about how the data is actually crunched and to what extent the data takes into consideration whether or not the sort of overall group that was used for training a data set was representative. And I think that as we think about data set, data inputs, and actual analysis, those are 3 areas where there's a lot of naivete, both by users, a lot of training around how to program technology without thinking about what it means. And then there's a lot of valid, but I would say overly broad backlash against the use of technology for various things. And so the way when Peter and I sit down and talk about projects that we want to take on and the ways that we would like to improve algorithms or play a role in algorithm fairness with a project, it often has to do with kind of addressing all of those 3 issues in ways that can achieve more equitable outcomes for the people who are affected.
So that actually was going to be my next question. When you focus on bias, impact, and scale, what does that actually mean for the way you approach research and data partnerships?
Yeah.
Definitely, algorithms are a great example of that, because the toolkit we use to evaluate an algorithm for discriminatory behavior and to create new algorithms is very similar across these different areas. So despite, say, working in education on early warning systems or resume screening algorithms in workforce or tenant screening algorithms in housing, the toolkit and approach we use is very similar across those. And aspects and definitions of fairness have been, those are not new and not something that we've developed. There are many definitions of fairness.
Mm-hmm.
Disparate impact is probably one of the most salient ones that we think about. Take two people with the same potential, and are they treated differently? So, same potential productivity, for instance, or same likelihood of repayment in the housing or lending space. Are they treated differently based on their race? Is one definition of fairness. And what are the tools we can use to evaluate that? And so that's often the first step when we work with a partner is you've got some sort of screening process or process for labeling a person as at risk or should be interviewed or not. And is that process satisfying this definition of fairness? It doesn't have to be that definition. It could be an alternative of interest. And then that's something we do by taking in their data and taking in the process that is making these decisions, and then importantly, linking them up to outcomes of these students. So are you interviewed? If you're interviewed, are you hired? If you're hired, what is some measure of your productivity, say your retention over 30, 60, 90 days? If you're flagged as at risk, what happens to you subsequently? Are you more or less likely to graduate? And in the housing space or lending space, it's do you repay a loan? And when we make those linkages, we can conduct this research. But then I think what's novel about what we do is even fairness constraints are not necessarily a new area of research. It's the estimation of those fairness constraints, which is more novel and work that our collaborators have really pushed the frontier on in blending aspects of computer science, prediction algorithms with the kind of causal inference and quasi-experimental variation that has really been the focus of economics and econometrics. And that allows us to overcome some of the issues in understanding bias and mitigating it. Once we do that, the nice thing is, a lot of our partners want to understand if their algorithms are discriminating, and then they obviously want to fix that. So this is code that they can change and impact that we can then see realized in these different domains.
Practical. Yeah. But I guess I meant that actually in a different way, which is, are there certain research and data partnerships that you seek out, either because the data is just so rich or the potential for impact? Because it's your impact thing too, that, we want to scale it to 60,000 people, not 60. So, we want to get out of a weekend texting people individually.
Yeah. Well, I think the toolkit we're using, as I said, what's interesting is it's largely the same approach that I was just describing. So the sort of data and applications are really numerous, right? I have mentioned ones in education, but lending is a huge space, right? And a lot of companies are kind of touting fairness, but there's no well-defined way for a company to say that their algorithm is being fair. So it's not uncommon to say, well, we don't use race and gender explicitly in our algorithms to predict outcomes, so we're not biased. And that's not true for a lot of definitions of bias and fairness. So I think what's appealing is that there's an increasing amount of algorithmic decision making, and the tools we're developing are readily applicable to all of those settings. What we're doing now, I think, is establishing some proving points across these different areas.
Okay. And I guess, Sara, do you have an ideal partner that you would want to work with? Someone that would just be like, just a great place to run the kit?
Oh my goodness. Honestly, this is not just me being judicious. I genuinely believe that we've we're currently we have so many great partners right now. But I guess my, the line of work that, so this is personal as opposed to speaking on behalf of me and Peter, but the line of work that ultimately got me and Peter connected is the work that I've done on algorithm fairness in hiring specifically. And Peter has this amazing research around what the actual technical design of an algorithm, which is filtering resumes, and the extent to which the algorithm should replicate, favor the people who have been favored in the past for interviews versus go out and experiment with people who never got the interview, maybe because they didn't go to the right school. And by the way, I do think that that's, heavily overlaps with education, because if education policy is around preparing people for the workforce, then a lot of the work that Peter's doing is getting employers out of the rut of, favored schools, favored degrees, et cetera, and really looking at the person. And I think, that one research bit has identified, we have so many more questions that build on that. And I would love to continue. This was with a Fortune 500 employer, and happened to be with an employer who, I think that we would love to do it with a Fortune 10 employer, and a Fortune 10 employer who was able to really track the employment outcomes and success of the people employed for a very long time. This was also with the entry-level roles post-college, and I would love to see this done for frontline workforce. So
and over a longer time horizon. Yeah.
Over a longer time horizon.
Homing in on your question a bit further about kind of what is an ideal partner for us, it's one that often is collecting high dimensional data on individuals, and then also not only has the data on sort of somebody's background characteristics, but what subsequently happens to them throughout whatever algorithmic screening process. So the decisions that are being made by an algorithm, and then the resulting outcomes associated with it. So for instance, in the hiring space, it's what are the characteristics of an incoming applicant, what happens at each stage of the interview process, and then what are on-the-job outcomes that are tracked subsequently. And you could imagine analogous set of data in the education space, right? The incoming characteristics of background characteristics of a student, the decision of an algorithm, and then subsequent education performance. And so the ideal platform partner for us has a large number of users, because that increases their potential for impact, and is collecting data throughout that process.
Right. So I guess that would be one of, and so it sounds amazing and everybody wants to believe they have all this great data, but the big considerations are the blocks here when conducting research like this. I'm sure you run into legal hurdles, data hurdles. What is sort of the things that impede progress or process here?
Yeah, great question. We think of kind of three areas of infrastructure we have to develop with a given platform. So there's legal infrastructure, as you mentioned. That's often the first, most immediate hurdle, and can be really a lengthy back and forth. At this point, we've gone through it enough that we have template legal agreements that we've used in the past, which speed up the process quite a bit. And the specific obstacles within that are obviously data privacy and addressing that. Can we access this highly sensitive data from a company and do so in a secure way that protects anonymity? And another aspect is around intellectual property and who owns that intellectual property. We like to create public goods, write research without needing approval from our partners about what we write, subject to preserving privacy. And so our agreements maintain that we own the intellectual property of aspects that we develop, We have a full right to publish, subject to the constraints I just described, but we can, we're happy to give out license to use what we're doing, and often we want to do that for free precisely so we can see our work scaled and having impact. But then there's the data infrastructure side, right? Companies aren't built for doing research and conducting research on their data. So that involves, hey, which of these 1,000 relatable tables, and that's not an exaggeration at all. We have platforms that have more than 1,000 tables to work with. Which one of these do you want to work with? And what do we want to merge or not? And creating kind of repeatable code that we can use to extract the data we want, and that data other researchers will want to use, not just us. We think of building this data infrastructure again as a public good, not just for folks at our lab, but affiliates of our lab and partners. And then testing infrastructure. Once we innovate something or develop an insight, we want to be able to rigorously evaluate it. So those, I think, are the 3 big hurdles to getting a lot of the research we do done, at least.
And not just data, real-time data, right? Like this is not just these tables, they're real-time.
Absolutely,
data.
yeah. And so developing the code and infrastructure to pull that, and again, in a secure fashion, is critical. Yeah.
So you've mentioned a couple of times that you guys have a process that uses a toolkit across the different partners and partnerships. I think you're working towards creating a toolkit that someone else might be able to use to screen a system. Is that correct? And where are you in that effort?
I mean, Sarah, maybe this is an area you just...
when you say, so it is a plan of ours to ultimately create technology that allows businesses that leverage algorithms to review them for fairness. I think that that's a middle term goal of ours. We are, again, the research that we're currently conducting, I would say, is all kind of building blocks to that, and to understanding the different ways that bias might come about, or even the nuances about, what's the outcome variable, what's the ideal outcome variable that we would be looking towards. There's a lot in some ways of qualitative research or just conversations that we have with partners, which are crucial for going into the way we understand how businesses understand their data, and how to make something that's easily usable. I was going to say utilizable, usable for businesses as well. So just getting a sense of how to develop something which is plug and play is really the priority, I would say, for 2022.
Because that would be amazing. I mean, talk about scaling impact, and then sure, there's a million hurdles when you talk about sort of giving people access, because the data isn't yours at the end of the day. But how do you work with collaborators? Do you work with collaborators? How do you work with the community of researchers with some of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I said, kind of we even talked about the name of our research lab.
Right.
Yeah, you think of this infrastructure in physics, right, where you create this big particle collider, and you bring in researchers from all over the world to do cutting edge research. We think in kind of an analogous way with our digital platform partners. Let's build the infrastructure that we just described in those areas. And a lot of that is a fixed cost, right? So what we do is try and raise philanthropic resources to pay those fixed costs, to help companies work with researchers. And so that, typically what happens otherwise is every partner is reinventing the wheel. Like, oh, okay, we've got to create a legal agreement between such and such university and the company, and another university and the company. We can create these templates and work with these companies to do that. And we can bring in lab affiliates who can be directly under our legal auspices, so they don't have to do this with their own institutions. Or if they do decide to do that, they already have a template that they know works with the partner. And then again, written the code to pull all the data we've just described and sort of shown these kind of pilot projects about the potential benefits. And so, yeah, we have affiliates across a number of universities, folks who work with us and rely on us taking over a lot of these aspects of partner relationships and data management and such, so that they can really think about just the research and not these other ancillary aspects, despite them being major hurdles to access.
And do you have a lot of affiliates at this point, or is that something you're developing?
We have a lot of collaborators, both who are university professors, but also graduate student researchers. I don't know what number we're at now, but it's certainly more than a dozen. I'm not sure I could enumerate it readily, but quite a few. And we think that our ability to do this and open up access is also a big point of equity too, so that folks who don't have these resources can work with these platforms and answer questions that we wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
Yeah, it does seem like once you get the platform, you could query it along a number of lines. What would you say that each of you, and love for both of you to answer, would you say you're optimists or pessimists when it comes to our future with algorithms, which are not going away, by the way?
Yeah, that's I'll maybe take a stab. I mean, I guess I go back and forth on this in some ways. Generally, you might every time I think I'm pessimistic, I look at what movie Netflix has recommended to me, and I'm like, wow, this could not be further from my preferences. And I think we're a long way off from any sort of AI apocalypse. I think generally there's a tremendous amount of potential, and probably a lot of the risks that we're seeing, are far from being realized. And it's just one of the questions is how can we get ahead of them rather than kind of waiting to see discrimination totally automated. And I think that's one area that we're excited to sort of step in and rather make this work transparent and having researchers be at the lead of working with practitioners rather than letting companies kind of fumble through it in the dark.
Sarah, would you agree? Are you I thought it was really funny that Peter's example was, I would be like irritated that the recommendation wasn't right, but you see that as cause for hope.
I think honestly, it really depends on the day. I believe two things about this. One is that I think that legislation, which is starting to, policymakers are starting to think about the roles that algorithms play in determining the trajectory of people's lives. And I worry that they're a little bit behind where the algorithms are. So I'm curious to see where that goes. And then the real opportunity, I think, for being able to leverage technology super positively and all of the amazing technological advantages is going to have a lot to do with making sure that we're creating a population that is digitally savvy enough in some ways to understand the role that automation is playing in the world in which they live. One of the things that I'm very excited about within Learning Collider is the amount of effort that we're putting into packaging what we've learned for a general public. And we're very much at the beginning of this right now, but I love thinking about the fact that the research that we're creating isn't just going to reside in the ivory tower, and that educators will be able to learn about how early warning systems are identifying students at risk, rather than just kind of know that there's something in the cloud that occasionally pings parents randomly.
Yeah, you mentioned that on your website too, that you really get excited when your work reaches audiences outside of scientists, and that lay audience and that education is so important. What can you talk about any of the initiatives you're going through to? I mean, that's a whole education effort on its own.
Yeah, I mean,
A little
I
daunting.
joined, it's so fun. I joined Learning Collider in April. And as you mentioned, when you introduced me, I come with the amazing benefit of having been a Dial Fellow through the Emerson Collective, which is, I received amazing training on PR and communications for Luddites like me. And so we've spent a lot of the time since I joined thinking about, what target audiences look like and what's the best way to reach people. We will have our first white paper coming out early in Q1 2022 around the hiring paper that I mentioned earlier. And then those will also be broken down into blog posts. So we've ultimately decided that super digestible snippets of readable information is probably the way we're going to start, because we, again, educators, HR, talent recruiters, there are people who do not necessarily fancy themselves statisticians. We can show up in their Google searches and share what we're doing through Twitter, and that's gonna be where we start, and it's really where my heart is right now. I'm very excited about it.
That's really interesting. So it's not just even a hybrid organizational model or business model that you're pursuing. There's also like a hybrid audience model, right? So you want other researchers to be able to use your platform, and you want people to understand what's happening with these algorithms. So you're trying to manage a lot of complexity in the middle of your research here. What
Yeah.
which is admirable, and I wish you a ton of luck with that, because I think that it's very interesting to me, and I think sort of your structure and your audiences reflect a more modern approach to some of these things that sort of engage the whole community. It's one of the reasons we wanted to have you as a guest.
It is our goal. Yeah, I think it's the beauty. I mean, if I could just quickly sing Peter's praises, I think it's kind of the beauty of our collaboration as well, where we started our careers in the same place in academia and took very different routes, and have and clicked right from the start, and have been able to say, like, okay, you do the papers, you do the business and the PR and the lay audience, and like and it's allowed us to keep both sides covered while making progress as an organization. It feels very fortunate.
I would just add too, I mean, I think it's hard to have impact without addressing all of those audiences. There's a lot of just reflexive knee-jerk reactions to algorithms that just are associated with bias. And you mentioned sort of optimist, pessimist, and I think a tremendous amount of optimism for the potential for AI and algorithms to improve outcomes for the reasons we just described, right? But you can't highlight those benefits unless you address some of these, I'd say, kind of like ill-defined associations with algorithms as just very negative or kind of maybe abstract. And so making the what's going on clearer, both in terms of the status quo, as I mentioned, human decision making or whatever it might be, and the potential to address some of these biases and discrimination with algorithms while improving targeting allocation of interventions that can reduce inequality and promote equality of opportunity. That's something that we didn't have the technology to do even not that long ago.
Yeah, so to that end, what happens next? Do you see us ever getting to the point, when I say us, I mean all of us, where it would be required for business, organizations, government to use tools to screen their algorithms for bias?
Yeah, I was approached by a philanthropy seeking sort of like big ideas for 2022, and I was mulling it over, and also talking to some of our partners about this, that we're saying, particularly in the hiring space, that a lot of companies are developing algorithms kind of in the dark with respect to bias. They want to address it and don't want to develop algorithms with bias or discriminatory behavior, but they don't really know how to do it, and they don't really know what criteria they solve and what is like a threshold that is acceptable or not. And so I think what would be ideal is to have people at the intersection of these three areas. So practitioners, companies who are writing these algorithms, estimating them, policymakers who are regulating them or thinking about regulating them. New York State just put in some kind of some sort of regulation to audit algorithms. But again, what that means is, and what criteria should be satisfied is not always spelled out well. And then I think having researchers as well who are, understand not only what these various definitions can be and their trade-offs, right? I mean, there's so many definitions of fairness. You quite literally, I mean, it's been shown that you cannot satisfy all of them at once. So it's impossible to satisfy even, three aspects of fairness in a lot of situations simultaneously. And so bringing insights from researchers to sort of how do we ameliorate these problems, to practitioners to help adopt them, to policymakers to help regulate in a way that can maintain efficiency and benefits, but also transparency would be, I think, a huge benefit.
So that sounds, since this is the year end, dangerously close to a New Year's resolution. Do you guys have what is your wish for 2022? This is one of the big ideas of 2022, right? Do you have a sort of some summation of it for the next year as we continue down this path together?
I could take a modest stab at it. I'm actually, Sarah keeps these thoughts much more coherently in her head than I do. But I think for us right now, I'll just say one aspect, because by no means is the only, is creating a lot of proving points with partners, particularly around the benefits and risks of algorithms and ameliorating those risks. So, we highlighted some of those areas. We love to create more proving points with partners to show what can be done, what risk can be mitigated, while realizing some of the benefits to promote equality of opportunity and reduce inequality at scale. And so I think that will be really exciting for us in the next year, in addition to what I was just describing at the kind of intersection of policy and practitioners and researchers.
Is there anything to add?
No, I think Peter said it quite well. We're at a point where kind of standardizing some of our growth and our messaging is really going to be where our focus is over the next year, and that's an incredibly exciting place to be. So yeah.
If someone wanted to get in touch with you to collaborate as an affiliate or whatever, where's the best way for them to reach you?
So don't bother Peter, because he has way too many things going on. Part of my job is to protect Peter and make space for him to complete his academic research. You can email me, Sara@learningcollider.org, and definitely particular sort of invitation to academics who are interested in collaborating. I am one of the sort of interested in building our backlog and keeping people in mind for future projects. And also you can find me on Twitter, Nadel Sara without an H. Oh yeah, Sara without an H at learningcollider.org, SARA, and Nadel Sara, NADEL SARA on Twitter.
Well, thank you both so much for your time, and also, for your work, because I know firsthand some of the work that's being done with the affordable housing group, and it's great. It's great to see. So thanks so much. We appreciate your time.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, and for the work you're doing as well. Really important, really valuable.
Thanks.